welcome to your own personal deep dive, into, I think, one of the most iconic events in history, the French Revolution.
It's certainly one of those things that everybody has heard of,
Oh, yeah.
but maybe don't know as much about as they think they do.
Exactly. And we're going to be using, as our source material today, a ninth grade textbook,
Okay.
which I know might sound a little basic, but trust me, there are some pretty fascinating nuggets of insight buried in these pages.
I think that's something that's often overlooked, actually, is, even something as seemingly basic as a textbook can hold a surprising amount of complexity. It's not just about sort of memorizing names and dates and battles. It's really about understanding how those things kind of ripple outwards and shape the world that we live in today.
Right, and that's what we're here for. We're not just going to skim the surface. We're diving deep
Yeah.
into kind of the contradictions at the heart of the revolution, the twists and turns that might surprise you,
Yeah.
and the lasting impact, it had on, concepts like equality and freedom.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like the ideas that were really at the core of the French Revolution are still things that we're grappling with today.
Absolutely.
So this is a chance to kind of go on a journey and connect the dots to see how seemingly small events and decisions really set the stage for, a massive social and political upheaval.
All right, so let's unpack this revolution. Our textbook drops us right into France in 1774. King Louis XVI inherits a kingdom drowning in debt. 2 billion livres.
Oh, wow.
Can you even fathom that kind of debt?
That's a staggering sum. I mean, especially for, the 18th century.
Yeah,
And it really speaks to the kind of pressures that he must have been under right from the start.
absolutely.
And you have to remember, this is a time of, rigid social hierarchy. French society is divided into what they call the three estates. So you have the clergy, you have the nobility, and then you have everybody else, the peasants, the merchants, the artisans, all lumped together into what's called the third estate.
And if I remember correctly, only the third estate actually paid taxes, right?
You're exactly right. And we're not just talking about, a small income tax here or something. The third estate shouldered two major burdens. One was the tithes, Tithes, paid to the church, which was a tenth of their agricultural produce.
Wow.
A tenth. And then on top of that, they had the tally, which was a direct tax paid to the state.
So essentially they're working all year just to see, a huge chunk of their harvest go directly to those who already have vast wealth and privilege.
That's exactly the problem. And you can imagine how this created this kind of simmering unrest among the people.
Oh, absolutely. Like you've got this massive, portion of the population carrying the weight of the kingdom,
Yeah.
while the clergy and the nobility are, living these lavish lifestyles
Yeah.
and enjoying special privileges.
Right. It's a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately for Louis XVI, he ends up providing the spark that ignites this powder keg.
Oh, how so?
Well, in 1789, he decides to call a meeting of the Estates General. His goal, you guessed it, impose even more taxes.
Oh, no.
Bad timing.
It seems like a terrible idea given the circumstances.
It was a major misstep. And the Third Estate saw this as, a blatant disregard for their struggles.
Right. I mean, they're already struggling to survive, and he's
Right.
like, let's add more taxes to the mix.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, they were initially locked out of the Estates General entirely.
Oh, wow. So they weren't even allowed to participate in the discussions about their own faith.
Right. It just added insult to injury. When they finally gained entry, their representation was limited,
Of course.
which just further fueled their anger and frustration.
So at this point, they're probably feeling pretty unheard and pretty disregarded.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. The Third Estate came to the Estates General with a pretty radical demand. They demanded one person, one vote.
Wow. That's a pretty revolutionary concept for the time.
It was a direct challenge to the existing power structure, where the First and Second Estates held all the influence.
So how did Louis XVI react to this?
Not well. He rejected it outright.
Of course he did.
But the Third Estate refused to be silenced. They took a bold step and formed the National Assembly.
So basically they're saying, we're not going to wait for the king's permission anymore. We're taking control.
Exactly. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority.
And that's where I'd say things really start to heat up. This is where we see the shift from simmering unrest to outright rebellion.
You're absolutely right. The formation of the National Assembly was a pivotal moment. It was a declaration that the people would no longer be ignored. And this act of defiance set the stage for a series of events that would change France, and indeed the world, forever.
I can't wait to dive into those events, but we're going to have to save that for the next part of our deep dive. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break.
I mean, you can just imagine the tension in the air after the National Assembly formed, right? Like everyone's kind of holding their breath, waiting to see what's going to happen
Nice.
next.
Like, what's the king going to do?
Exactly. And then on June 20, 1789, the National Assembly gathers at a pretty unusual spot, an indoor tennis court in Versailles.
A tennis court.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to picture these serious revolutionaries, debating the fate of France while surrounded by tennis rackets and nets.
Right. It just goes to show how quickly things were changing. And it was at this tennis court that they took the famous tennis court oath.
Oh, yeah, the tennis court oath. I've heard of that.
They vowed to write a constitution for France and
No.
to limit the king's power.
So essentially, they were saying, we're not going to wait for the king's permission anymore. We're taking control.
Exactly. It was a direct challenge to the absolute monarchy that had ruled France for centuries.
Which, as you can imagine, Louis XVI was not too happy about.
No, he was not. In fact, he ordered troops to Paris.
Ooh, that seems like a pretty provocative move.
It was a major escalation. And unfortunately for Louis, it backfired spectacularly.
How so?
Well, because just a few weeks later, on July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris rose up in one of the most iconic events of the Revolution, the storming of the Bastille.
Okay, everyone's heard of the storming of the Bastille. But I have to admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details. What exactly was the Bastille and why was it such a big deal?
So the Bastille was a prison. But it was more than just that. It represented the king's authority, the oppression of the people. Is this looming symbol of everything that was wrong with the old regime.
So storming the Bastille wasn't just about freeing a few prisoners. It was about striking a blow against tyranny itself.
Exactly. It was a symbolic act of defiance.
I can see why that would resonate with people.
Our textbook describes Parisians forming these armed militias, driven by a mix of fear and fury, and this incredible hope for a better future.
Wow, it must have been an incredible sight. A symbol of royal power being torn apart by the very people it had oppressed for so long.
It was a turning point. Faced with this undeniable display of popular force, Louis XVI had no choice but to recognize the National Assembly and give up some of his power.
So he finally realizes the gravity of the situation.
It seems
Okay, so we've got the National Assembly, the tennis court oath, the storming of the Bastille, the king kind of reluctantly ceding some of his power. What happens next in this whirlwind of revolution?
Well, the revolution picks up speed. In August of 1789, the National Assembly abolishes the feudal system.
Whoa, hold on. They just abolish centuries-old power structures in a single decree.
Just like that.
I mean, I'm trying to picture what that must have been like for the people living through this time. The nobility losing their privileges overnight, the peasants freed from their feudal obligations. It must have felt like the world was turning upside down.
It absolutely was a monumental shift in French society.
And was the church spared from this wave of change?
Not at all. Their lands were confiscated, and the clergy lost their privileges. The First Estate, once considered untouchable, was now feeling the tremors of the revolution.
It's amazing how quickly things were changing. So with the feudal system abolished, what did the National Assembly focus on next?
Well, they turned their attention to creating a new framework for France. In 1791, they drafted a constitution that divided power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches.
So checks and balances like we have today.
Exactly. It was a radical departure from the absolute monarchy that had existed before. And they even enshrined the principle of one person, one vote.
So finally, the ideals of equality that the Third Estate had been fighting for were being put into practice.
Well, sort of. And this is where we see the revolution's, complexity and contradictions.
Oh, how?
While the Constitution of 1791 was a significant step forward, voting rights were limited to active citizens.
Active citizens. What does that even mean?
It meant men who own property.
So women, the poor, those without property, they were still excluded.
Exactly.
It's like they took one step forward and two steps back.
It's a reminder that revolutions are messy, complex processes. They rarely achieve their lofty goals in a neat and tidy fashion.
So how did the people who were excluded from voting react to this?
There was a lot of frustration and anger. Many people felt betrayed by the revolution. They argued that it had replaced one form of inequality with another.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have felt like a broken promise. So with this new constitution in place, what happened to Louis XVI? Did he just accept his new, less powerful role?
Well, on the surface, it seemed like he did. He became a constitutional monarch with his powers significantly limited, but behind the scenes, Louis was far from happy. He was secretly plotting with Austria and Prussia.
So he was trying to undermine the revolution from within.
He was hoping to restore his absolute power and crush the revolution entirely.
Wow. So even with all these changes, there were still powerful forces working to undermine the revolution.
Absolutely. The revolution had entered a new dangerous phase. The king's plotting created this atmosphere of paranoia and fear. And this fear, coupled with the ongoing war with Austria and Prussia, created the perfect conditions for the rise of a new, more radical faction, the Jacobins.
The Jacobins. Now that's a name that sends shivers down my spine.
They would certainly leave their mark on the revolution.
I bet they would. But we're going to have to wait until the next part of our deep dive to find out more about them.
Yeah.
So we left off with Louis XVI secretly plotting with Austria and Prussia. A war raging beyond France's borders. And this new faction, the Jacobins, rising to prominence. I'm sensing things are about to get even more intense.
Yeah, you could say that the year is 1792 and tensions are reaching a boiling point.
Okay.
The National Assembly is aware of the threat posed by Louis' scheming, and they make a bold move. They declare war on Austria and Prussia.
Wow, so now the revolution isn't just about internal conflict, it's an international struggle.
That's right. The revolution's ideals are no longer confined to France's borders. It's a fight for the very soul of Europe.
I see. So it's monarchy versus democracy, the old world versus the new.
You got it. And within France itself, the political landscape is shifting dramatically. The Jacobin Club, led by the enigmatic Maximilien Robespierre, gains significant influence.
Okay, so we talked earlier about how the Constitution of 1791, didn't quite live up to its promise of equality. Were the Jacobins pushing for a more radical version of the revolution?
Yes, they were. They represented the common people, the ones who felt most betrayed by the revolution's shortcomings.
I see.
They were often called the sans-culottes, meaning without fancy knee breeches.
Sans-culottes.
Yeah, it was a way of distinguishing themselves from the aristocracy.
So they were the voice of the people who felt left behind, the ones who were still struggling despite the revolution's promise.
Actually, they wanted to sweep away all remnants of the old order and create a truly egalitarian society.
And were they willing to use force to achieve their goal?
They were, which brings us to the Reign of Terror.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
In 1792, the monarchy is abolished and France becomes a republic.
A republic. Wow.
Louis XVI is tried for treason and publicly executed.
So the revolution has claimed the king himself.
It has. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, established the Committee of Public Safety, which quickly becomes the de facto government of France.
And this is where the Reign of Terror begins.
Unfortunately, yeah.
What exactly happened during this time?
From 1793 to 1794, the guillotine becomes a symbol of the revolution. Robespierre and his followers believed that terror is necessary to protect the revolution from its enemies.
Terror.
They used the guillotine to eliminate anyone suspected of opposing the Republic.
Anyone.
Aristocrats, clergy, even fellow revolutionaries who disagree with their methods.
So the revolution is devouring its own children.
You could say that it was a dark and bloody chapter in the revolution's history.
How did it end?
Well, Robespierre himself eventually fell victim to the revolution's insatiable appetite for blood.
Oh, wow.
He was arrested and executed in 1794, marking the end of the Reign of Terror.
So the revolution consumes its own leader.
It's a reminder that even those who start revolutions can become victims of the forces they unleash.
Absolutely. So we've seen the rise and fall of figures like Robespierre, the dramatic shifts in power, the struggle to define the meaning of equality. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And while the revolution itself ended, its ideas continued to reverberate throughout Europe and the world.
I mean, that's what's so fascinating about the French Revolution, right? It wasn't just a French event. It was a global event that had a profound impact on the course of history.
Absolutely. What are your takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think it's crucial to remember that revolutions, even those fought for the most noble causes, are complex, messy processes. They often fall short of their ideals and can lead to unintended consequences.
I agree with that. It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear. It's often marked by setbacks, contradictions, and even tragedies.
So we need to learn from history, both its triumphs and its failures, so we can continue to strive for a better world.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Me too. This deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
The French Revolution, for all its complexities, is a story that continues to resonate with us today.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the fight for equality and justice is an ongoing struggle, one that requires constant vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to learn from the past.
Well said.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the French Revolution. Until next time.